Imagine being alone on a tranquil lake, your line in the water, waiting for that perfect catch. But as the fog thickens, the water starts moving in ways it shouldn't, and you realize you're not alone. What lurks beneath the surface is something much worse than any fish. It was supposed to be a routine weekend getaway for Marcus, an avid fisherman. Blackwater Lake, nestled deep within a remote national forest, had always been a favorite spot of his. The lake was known for its serenity, the perfect place to unwind, and rumor had it that the waters were teeming with fish that hadn't been overfished by tourists. The area around Blackwater was isolated, with only a small town nearby that had long since fallen into decline. The locals avoided the lake at night, but to Marcus, that made it all the more appealing. Arriving at dusk, Marcus could feel the eerie stillness in the air. The sun was setting behind the thick pines, casting long shadows over the water. His boat bobbed gently as he pushed off from shore, the only sounds coming from the soft lapping of water against the hull and the occasional rustle of the trees. As the evening wore on, Marcus cast his line, enjoying the solitude. He had the entire lake to himself, a rare luxury. But as night fully set in, a thick fog rolled across the water, swallowing the trees and obscuring the distant shore. The air seemed to grow heavier and colder, and something felt off. The rhythmic splash of water suddenly stopped, and an unsettling silence took its place. Out of nowhere, the boat gave a violent jolt. Marcus thought he had snagged something large, maybe a big catfish or bass. But when he looked at his line, it hung slack, unmoving. He peered over the side of the boat, scanning the murky water, but all he could see was his reflection staring back at him through the fog. Then, the surface of the lake rippled, far from where his line had dropped. The water churned as if something large was moving beneath it. Something that wasn't a fish. Marcus's heart raced, but he convinced himself it was probably a beaver, or some other wildlife. He reeled in his line, but before he could cast again, he heard it. Something faint, barely audible over the soft slosh of water. It sounded like a whisper, distant but unmistakable. It was coming from the fog. "Help!" Marcus froze. He strained his ears, thinking it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But the voice came again, louder this time, closer. "Please, help!" Panic surged through his veins. He called out into the fog, "Who's there?" But there was no response, only the eerie whisper of wind and water. His boat began to sway, not from the wind, but as if something below was pushing it. He quickly started rowing toward the shore, but no matter how hard he rowed, the fog seemed to thicken, and the distant lights from his campsite never appeared. It was as if he was stuck, circling the same patch of water. And then he saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the fog, barely visible but unmistakably human. The figure was wearing what appeared to be old, tattered clothes, dripping with water. Their eyes, wide and lifeless, stared directly at Marcus, and their mouth moved slowly, mouthing the words, "Help." Terrified, Marcus shouted again, asking who they were, but the figure didn't move. The fog around it swirled and pulsed, and suddenly, the boat was jerked violently to the side. Marcus was thrown off balance, crashing into the side of the boat as something massive passed beneath him, its dark shadow barely visible beneath the surface. He scrambled to his feet, trying to steady himself, but the boat was moving, being dragged toward the center of the lake. The figure disappeared into the fog, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic. Marcus's mind raced. Was this some kind of hallucination? Or had he stumbled upon something far more sinister? The water beneath him surged again, and this time, he saw it clearly. A pale, bloated hand reaching up from the depths, clawing at the side of the boat. With a scream, Marcus grabbed his oar and began to beat the water, but the hand vanished as quickly as it appeared. His heart pounded in his chest, every muscle tense as he waited for the next attack. But nothing came. The water was still again, the fog slowly beginning to lift. The shore came into view, and Marcus, drenched in sweat, rowed as fast as he could. He reached the shore and stumbled onto dry land, gasping for air. Looking back at the lake, the fog had completely dissipated. The water was calm, almost serene, as if nothing had happened. But Marcus knew better. He packed his gear and left Blackwater Lake that night, never to return. The next morning, as he passed through the small town on his way home, Marcus stopped at a diner for a cup of coffee. He couldn't resist asking the locals if they knew anything about the strange figure he had seen. The old man at the counter gave him a long, hard look before speaking. "Blackwater Lake's been cursed for years," he said. "Years ago, a group of fishermen went missing out there, and their bodies were never found. Some say their spirits still wander the lake looking for help, but anyone who tries to save them ends up just like them." Marcus never went fishing again. What would you do if the ocean swallowed someone whole, and when you looked again, there was no trace of them ever existing? A fishing trip at Widow's Cove turns into a nightmare when the sea reveals something darker than the abyss itself. It was known as Widow's Cove for a reason. The small, secluded inlet off the coast of Maine had a dark reputation. Local fishermen whispered that those who ventured out alone never returned, and the few who did were never the same. But the fishing was said to be exceptional, and for some, the temptation was worth the risk. Peter, a seasoned fisherman in his mid-30s, had heard all the stories but didn't believe in local legends. He'd fished in dangerous waters his entire life, and Widow's Cove seemed no different. On a chilly autumn morning, Peter set out for what was supposed to be a routine trip. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden light over the dark waters as his boat cut through the waves. The sea was calm, the wind brisk but manageable, and Peter felt at ease. He had always preferred fishing alone. It gave him time to think, to escape the stress of daily life. As the boat entered the deeper part of the cove, Peter noticed the water becoming unnaturally still. The waves, which had been gently lapping at his boat moments earlier, seemed to stop entirely, leaving the surface eerily smooth. He checked his equipment, making sure everything was in order, and cast his line. Hours passed, but there was no bite. It was strange. Peter had never had this much trouble catching anything, especially in waters rumored to be full of fish. Growing frustrated, he decided to move farther into the cove, to a spot where the cliffs loomed high above, casting long shadows over the water. The sun had disappeared behind a thick layer of clouds, darkening the sky and giving the cove an ominous feel. Still, Peter pressed on, determined to make the most of his day. Suddenly, his line tugged. Hard. Peter grinned, gripping his rod tightly as he began to reel in whatever had taken the bait. It was a strong pull, and whatever was on the other end was big. His muscles strained as he fought against the creature, adrenaline coursing through him. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the tension on the line went slack. He cursed under his breath, convinced the fish had gotten away. But then, something strange happened. The water around his boat began to bubble as if boiling. Peter leaned over the side, trying to see what was causing the disturbance, but the water was too dark, too deep. Without warning, a hand broke the surface. Peter staggered back in shock. The hand was pale, bloated, and covered in seaweed. It clawed at the air for a moment before vanishing beneath the waves. Peter's heart raced, his mind reeling. Had he imagined it? Was it some kind of sick prank? He peered over the edge again, but the water had returned to its calm, glassy state. He shook his head, trying to convince himself that he had just seen some debris, maybe a piece of driftwood. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Very wrong. Before he could process what had happened, the boat lurched violently. Peter lost his footing and slammed against the side of the boat. The bubbling returned, more intense this time, and the boat began to spin in a slow circle as if caught in some invisible whirlpool. Peter grabbed the edge of the boat, trying to steady himself, but the force pulling at the vessel was growing stronger. And then he heard it, a low, guttural moan rising from the depths of the water. It was unlike any sound he had ever heard before, deep and full of sorrow. It was as if the ocean itself was crying out in pain. Peter's stomach churned with dread. The air around him grew cold, and he could see his breath in the air, even though it was nowhere near freezing. Desperately, he tried to start the engine, but the boat wouldn't budge. It was as if some unseen force had anchored it in place. The moaning grew louder, more insistent, and the water began to churn violently. Peter's heart raced, panic setting in as he tried to think of a way out. But there was no escape. The sea had him now. Without warning, the water erupted around the boat. Dark, slimy figures began to emerge from the depths, their faces twisted in agony. They were human, or at least they had been. Their eyes were sunken, their skin pale and bloated, as if they had been lost to the sea for centuries. Their mouths gaped open, emitting that same low moan that sent shivers down Peter's spine. They began to circle the boat, their dead, vacant eyes fixed on him. Peter stumbled back, grabbing anything he could to defend himself. But what could he do against these creatures? He screamed for help, but there was no one around. Widow's Cove was as silent as the grave. The figures continued their slow, haunting circle around the boat, never getting closer, but never moving away. Peter could feel their presence pressing down on him, suffocating him with fear. His mind raced. Were these the spirits of the fishermen who had disappeared? Had they come to claim him as one of their own? In a last-ditch effort, Peter threw a flare into the water, hoping to scare them off. The red light illuminated the figures for a brief moment, casting eerie shadows across their grotesque faces. But it didn't deter them. If anything, it seemed to agitate them. Suddenly, one of the figures reached up, its cold, dead hand grabbing the edge of the boat. Peter's heart nearly stopped as he watched the figure slowly pull itself up, its waterlogged body dripping onto the deck. The moaning grew louder, and soon more hands followed, pulling at the boat from every side. Peter screamed, grabbing his oar and swinging wildly, but it was no use. The hands were relentless, pulling him down and dragging him toward the edge of the boat. He fought with every ounce of strength he had, but the cold hands gripped tighter, their moans filling his ears. And then, everything went black. When Peter woke up, he was lying on the shore, drenched in seawater and gasping for air. His boat was nowhere to be seen. Disoriented, he stumbled to his feet, his mind trying to piece together what had happened. The last thing he remembered was the hands, the cold, dead hands pulling him under. He staggered into town, where the locals found him in a state of shock. When he tried to explain what had happened, no one believed him. They said he must have hit his head, or maybe he had been out in the sun too long. But Peter knew the truth. Widow's Cove had taken something from him, something he could never get back. And though he survived, he knew that the next fisherman to venture into those cursed waters might not be so lucky. Let's make this last story terrifying, something that will linger in the mind long after it's told. There's a reason why certain lakes and rivers are off limits. It's not just about the danger of the waters, it's about what's waiting beneath them. When three friends decide to fish in the deepest, most forbidden lake in the region, they discover that some things are never meant to be disturbed. The legend of Dead Man's Lake was one that had been passed down for generations. Hidden deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was a place that locals refused to go near, let alone fish in. The waters were unnaturally deep, colder than any lake in the area, and it was said that no one who ever entered those waters came back the same. Some never came back at all. But to Jake, Luis, and Kyle, it was nothing more than an old wives' tale. The trio had been fishing together for years, seeking out the most remote and challenging spots they could find. They considered themselves thrill seekers, laughing in the face of danger. When they heard about Dead Man's Lake, they didn't hesitate for a second. They packed their gear, grabbed a couple of beers, and set off for what they thought would be just another adventurous weekend. The road to the lake was rough, barely more than a dirt path through the dense woods. It was as if the forest itself didn't want them to find the lake. Thick fog clung to the trees, and the air was eerily silent, with not even the sound of birds or wildlife to break the tension. The closer they got, the more uneasy Jake felt, though he'd never admit it to his friends. When they finally arrived, the sight of the lake was unsettling. Dead Man's Lake stretched out before them, the water still and black as oil. It was so dark that it didn't reflect the sky. Instead, it seemed to absorb all the light around it. No waves, no movement, just a glassy surface that looked like it had been frozen in time. The air around the lake was unnaturally cold, biting at their skin despite the warmth of the summer sun. Luis was the first to break the silence. "Well, this is it," he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice wavered slightly. "Let's see if this place lives up to its name." They set up camp at the edge of the lake and got their boat into the water. As they paddled out into the center, the silence was suffocating. The water was so dark and deep that they couldn't see more than a few inches beneath the surface. A thick layer of mist clung to the lake's edges, making it feel like they were completely isolated from the world. They cast their lines, the quietness of the lake pressing down on them. Hours passed, and not a single fish bit. Kyle, always the jokester, muttered, "Maybe the fish are as dead as the legends say." Jake chuckled nervously, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. His eyes scanned the shoreline, but nothing moved. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, just the oppressive silence and the dark, still water beneath them. And then, without warning, Luis's rod bent sharply, the reel screaming as something massive took the bait. "Got one!" Luis shouted, gripping the rod tightly as he struggled to reel in whatever was on the other end. The boat rocked violently, the water splashing around them, but still, they couldn't see what was pulling him. "Must be a monster catfish," Kyle said, excitement flickering in his eyes. But Jake's stomach twisted with a sense of dread. The line was being pulled straight down, deeper into the lake, deeper than any fish could go. Luis fought with the rod, his face red from exertion. "This thing's huge," he gasped. "Help me out." Jake and Kyle grabbed the rod with him, trying to haul in whatever was dragging them down, but the force was incredible, far too strong for any fish. The water around the boat began to churn, swirling unnaturally, as if something below was stirring. And then, they saw it. Rising from the depths just beneath the surface was a massive, bloated form. At first, they thought it was some kind of enormous fish, but as it came closer, they realized with horror that it wasn't a fish at all. It was human, or at least it had been. The thing's skin was pale and slimy, a skeletal frame. Its eyes were empty, black pits, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. Seaweed and mud clung to its body, and its arms, long, grotesque arms, reached up toward the boat, its fingers curling like claws. The three men screamed, releasing the rod in terror, but the creature didn't stop. It reached the surface, its body floating eerily close to the boat, and then it did something that froze their blood. It spoke. "Come, down with me." The voice was barely more than a whisper, but it echoed in their heads, like the lake itself was speaking to them. The creature's hand reached out, grasping the side of the boat, pulling it down with impossible strength. The water around them bubbled and frothed, and suddenly, the boat was sinking, being dragged under by some unseen force. "We have to get out of here," Jake shouted, grabbing an oar and paddling frantically toward the shore. But the boat was moving against them, pulled toward the center of the lake as if caught in a whirlpool. The creature's lifeless eyes never left them, its mouth still gaping open in that grotesque, silent scream. Luis grabbed a knife from his tackle box and lunged at the creature, stabbing it in the arm. But instead of blood, a thick black ooze poured from the wound, staining the water around it. The creature didn't flinch, didn't react, it just kept pulling them down. Panic overtook them. Kyle, in a frenzy, tried to start the motor, but it sputtered and died, leaving them helpless as the boat tipped dangerously close to the waterline. The creature's clawed hands scraped against the side, and with a sickening lurch, the boat was dragged under. Cold, dark water flooded the boat, pulling the men into the abyss. Jake's vision blurred as he was submerged, the freezing water cutting through him like knives. He kicked frantically, trying to swim, but the current was too strong. It was dragging him down into the depths of Dead Man's Lake, where the light could never reach. Through the murky water, Jake saw them. Hundreds of them. Pale, bloated figures floating just beneath the surface, their eyes empty, their mouths open in eternal screams. They surrounded him, their hands reaching out, pulling him deeper, deeper. Just as the last breath left his lungs, something yanked him upward. Jake broke the surface, gasping for air, his body trembling from the cold. He clawed his way to shore, coughing up water, his heart racing. He looked around, expecting to see Luis and Kyle, but they were gone. The boat was gone. The lake was still, as if nothing had happened. Jake screamed their names, but only the eerie silence of Dead Man's Lake answered him. Jake was found 2 days later by a local search party, delirious and on the verge of hypothermia. When he told them what had happened, no one believed him. The authorities chalked it up to an accident. Luis and Kyle had drowned, and Jake had barely survived. But Jake knew the truth. He knew what was waiting beneath the surface. He never went fishing again, and neither will you, if you ever find yourself at Dead Man's Lake. And if you dare, don't forget to subscribe to the Mr. Spookis channel for more spine-chilling stories. Until next time, stay safe.